Well, good morning. 20, but I'm going to start like I like to. Questions? Moving. Following one that you hear about first in the Bible, Moses or Noah? Who comes first? All right. Deborah or Joshua? Joshua. Yes, he comes first. Deborah's one of the judges. She comes after. Maybe 120, 150 years, maybe? Maybe not that much. Solomon or Samuel? Samuel, yeah. All right, here's a tougher one. Jeroboam or Hezekiah? I might put the twist on you and say, which one? But I won't do that. Okay. Which comes first? Jesus turned the water into wine or he fed the 5,000? Wine. That's about the only way you can get a whole congregation of the Church of Christ to say wine. Wine, wine, wine. That might get me in trouble. Okay. So name the book where the following can be found. The famous passage about love that begins with the word love is. Good, 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 good. Oh, I got the chapter too. All right, name the book. God's law under the old covenant to the sons of Aaron. The book of... I'm not hearing any. Oh, sorry. God's law under the old covenant to the sons of Aaron. It's Leviticus, yeah. Levi, sons of Leviticus, yeah. Okay. How about this one? A prophet of God who was commanded to marry a prostitute. Oh, wow. Okay. All right, this one should be easy because we've just covered it. Stephen killed by stoning. Where will we find that? Acts. Here is the end of the matter. All has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments. Where would we find that? Very last of Ecclesiastes. What Bible character is being described? He told by his wife to curse God and die. Who's being talked about? Job, yeah. All right, this one might be a trick question, so listen carefully. The son of Pharaoh's daughter. Yes, Moses, yep. Okay, let's see if I have any more. I do, as a matter of fact. A couple more. Oh no, that's it. You got them all. We're going to have to come up with some new questions. So far, so good. Okay. We have been in Luke chapter 20, and we're coming to the close of Jesus' life. We have closed his ministry, both in Galilee and in Jerusalem. He's come back and forth a few times across the course of a couple of years, and he's now in Jerusalem to his death. And the next few days, across Luke 20 and the following chapters, he will meet his Passion Week, as we often call it. So somebody give me a recap, just a short recap, of what has taken place so far, maybe from kind of the middle to close of Luke 19. What's been going on so far? Okay, so this is the entry into Jerusalem. What happens? Yep. So he rides into Jerusalem, adorned and acting like the king. And the coats are laid in front of him. He's riding on the donkey. He comes into Jerusalem like the king, and the Pharisees tell him what? On the way in, the Pharisees say, hey, you can't do this. And what does Jesus say in response about the stones? Remember? People are crying out, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Yeah. And Jesus says, listen, just because you don't recognize who I am, if these people didn't, the earth itself would. Somebody's got to recognize the king. So the people recognize their king as he comes into Jerusalem. Rather than going into the temple or into the throne room, if there was such a place, and taking his place, what does he do? He goes into the temple. Yeah. He starts correcting. And so then he starts teaching. And this is where the problem comes in chapter 20, because the Sadducees come in and say, hey, who let you do this? You can't come in here and do this kind of thing. You can't march into Jerusalem like the king. You can't come in here and flip tables. We're in charge here. Who said you could do this? So that opens chapter 20 with this authority of Jesus being challenged. And you remember this great bit of genius from Jesus here. They said, who said you could do this? And he said, I'll answer, but you have to answer me a question first. The baptism of John, who did it come from? And they said, if we say it came from God, he's going to ask us why we didn't do it. But if we say it came from men, the people will kill us because they know that he was a prophet. So what do? Let's just say we don't know. And so that's what they say. They say, well, we don't know. And Jesus says, okay, well, I'm not going to tell you either by what authority I do these things. And here was the great bit of genius in it. If they had been honest with themselves and recognized John's baptism, who did John say Jesus was? Remember, he points at him and he says, behold the... Yeah. So to recognize John and his baptism was to recognize the authority of Jesus. So there's a touch of genius in there by Jesus. Had they been honest about John, they would have already recognized Jesus and his authority. And so I find it astonishing that even at this point where they're ready to kill him, Jesus is still ready to let them on board if they would only be honest and soften their hearts. But of course they don't do that. And that brings us to 20 and verse 9. And I think we just skimmed it last time round. So I want to read it again, and then I'll get you to detail the various elements of the allegory for me. So let's read. This is Luke 20, beginning in verse 9. So we began to tell a parable to the people. A man planted a vineyard, and he let it out to tenants, and went into another country for a long while. When the time came, he sent a servant to the tenants so that they would give him some of the fruit of the vineyard. But the tenants beat him and sent him away empty-handed. And he sent another servant, but they also beat and treated him shamefully, and sent him away empty-handed. He sent yet a third. This one they also wounded and cast out. Then the owner of the vineyard said, what shall I do? I will send my beloved son, and that term there is dense with meaning. I shall send my beloved son, perhaps they will respect him. But when the tenants saw him, they said to themselves, this is the heir. Let us kill him so that the inheritance may be ours. And they threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. What then will the owner of the vineyard do to them? He will come and destroy those tenants and give the vineyard to others. Now remember, we're speaking to the leaders of the temple, the Sanhedrin members. These specifically would have been Sadducees. When they heard this, they said, surely not. Now it's very telling. They were listening and they understood. But he looked directly at them. Jesus looked directly at them and he said, what then is this that is written? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Everyone who falls on that stone, Jesus says, will be broken to pieces. And when it falls on anyone, it will crush him. Okay, so you have a very intense back and forth here from Jesus. So let's break this parable down a little bit because it's really thinly veiled. We're going to take most of the elements here as allegory, so each element corresponds to something. The vineyard stands for what? Okay, so let's use the term Israel, and specifically Jerusalem, that represents its leadership and where you would go to Israel if you were expecting to be able to speak to the manager, if you will. I want to speak to the manager and get what I'm owed. I am the owner of the vineyard. So who's in charge here? Let me get what I'm due. So Israel, and specifically Jerusalem, is the vineyard. All right? The tenants. Who are the tenants? Okay. All right. They're the ones into whose charge the vineyard is left. so that there would be fruit bearing. They're going and taking care of the various processes. They're barreling up the wine. They're putting the wheat in the barns. They're growing. They're working. And there should be an expectation of, I'm here, it's time to collect. In this time, this parable that Jesus is supplying here was not a hypothetical. This was a very common occurrence. You had rich, usually at this time, Roman landlords who owned massive amounts of land, and they would lease it out to tenants. And then they would go back to their villas in Sicily, where they would live in luxury, and from time to time they would come and collect. But they wouldn't collect necessarily money. They weren't looking for the gold. They were looking for the produce that they could put on the market and sell and continue their riches. So this is just commerce, and it was common. And so what Jesus is offering here, everybody would have been pretty familiar with. So the tenants are the rulers of Israel. And the expectation from the rulers is what? When it's time to pay, you had better what? You had better have some produce. You should better have some fruit ready, because I have left this thing in your keeping. Let me see here. Anybody have to hire anybody? Anybody here, like the hiring manager or in charge of staff that you have to kind of bring in? Okay. When you hire somebody in and you give them some measure of freedom to do their job, what's your expectation of them? Right, yes, because you're responsible for them, and their work not only represents you, but also there's profit or loss to be had in their freedom. So if you give them the freedom and to work on their own competency, you're expecting them to be able to supply. That's what's happening here. These are the leaders, and their ability to walk around in long robes and be wealthy and demand from the people means that they are also responsible to God. Okay, that's important, because when Jesus is going to say in a minute he's going to take it away from these tenants and give it to somebody else, means that they're not doing a good job. Now, you remember just when I took over the Luke class, we had talked about the dishonest manager. Do you remember that parable? Very similar ideas here. There's this tenant in charge who should be doing certain work, and he's not doing it. Okay? All right. Who are the messengers then? Yes. Can you think of any of the prophets who were sent to Israel who were treated shamefully, beaten or killed or otherwise? Anybody? Say that again? Yeah, okay, that's a good answer. That's a good. That's like when kids say Jesus. Jesus is always the answer. All of the prophets were shamefully treated, just about. I think of Jeremiah specifically. He went to the people. God told him beforehand, hey, you're going to go speak to a hard-hearted people whose ears are closed. They're not going to listen to you. I'm sure, like as a preacher, if God said, Jordan, you're going to go preach all the days of your life and not a single person will listen to you, I'm going to say, God, I'm not going to do that. Let me do anything else, please. Okay? And so I'm sure Jeremiah from the outset was frustrated. But then when he tells the people the truth, what do? You know that passage where it says they put him down into a cistern? The cistern wasn't filled with water. It wasn't a water cistern. You understand? And so he was waist deep in mire, is what the King James says. He was being shamefully treated. And so here, just as a small example of some of the things that they did, they threw them out of the city, they killed them, and so this is a history lesson from Jesus using modern terminology. All right, so the messengers are the prophets, sent time after time. And then this term, the owner says, what am I going to do with these tenants? They haven't listened to my messengers, so what can I do? I'm going to up the ante, and I'm going to send my beloved son. This, to me, says a great deal about the nature of God. If I had some tenants and I had sent some people to them and they treated them shamefully, you better believe I'm not going to send them my son. I'm not going to send Lincoln down there. If they'll beat the people that I send, they're not getting my son. They're not going to get the opportunity to do that. And look at the terminology, my beloved son. There is both authority bound up in this. God has sent his son, and Jesus has just been talking about authority. But there's also value. This is my son whom I love. And so this parable speaks a great deal about the nature of God in my opinion, that God was willing, even after all this, to send his son anyway. Okay? Yes? Okay. Ah, that's right. Beloved son. Yes, indeed. Yep. And that's right. So again, the people can't really miss who's being talked about and what's being said. All right. So you have the son then is clearly Jesus. Okay. The beloved son is Jesus sent to the nation of Israel. And obviously then, who is the owner of the vineyard? Who planted this thing to get some fruit out of it? God did. You remember in Genesis, the people are spreading back out again after the Tower of Babel. The various nations are split up and they're going to spread across the earth. And God says, I'm going to pick a nation, Abraham, and I'm going to make them my own. And perhaps through this nation, I can bring about the good that will unify all the nations again. I can fix all of the human race if I can just get one nation in line. So Abraham and following. So God plants this vineyard in the hopes of getting that fruit. That's the fruit he wants. Faithfulness from Israel means he can translate that into faithfulness to all the nations. And that's what he wants, but they're not supplying that. So the sentence of judgment then, that he's going to take away the vineyard and give it to another, what's that about? Okay. Romans, yeah. Romans 9, 10, 11. Yeah. That's right. And I think ultimately reaching AD 70, where the Jewish system was completely kind of wiped away. And do you know what was kept in the temple? One of the most important things that was kept in the temple was not gold or even some of the instruments of worship. It was the genealogical records that could prove who the priests were. And if you couldn't say, I am the son of who is the son of who is the son of with proof, you actually can't prove anything. The whole Jewish system dissolved when their genealogical records went up in smoke. Nobody could prove who was a Jew and who belonged to this tribe. And so while they knew it in that generation, a couple of generations down the road, it wasn't provable anymore. And that was very purposeful, I believe, on God's, to dissolve the ethnic Judaism and to bring up the spiritual Israel in its place is here in its infancy being talked about. And you see it in its fullness in the theology of Paul in Romans and in Galatians. Okay, but we're getting a little off track there. Okay, good. So there's a lot of really clear allusions here. And Jesus is actually answering the question through the parable of whose authority, who gave him the authority. So even though he says, I'm not going to tell you outright that it's God, let me tell you a parable, and if your ears are open, you'll figure it out. So he tells them this. What was the sin of the tenants? Okay, selfishness. Let's expand that. Okay. Right. Okay. Sure. Okay. 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 And I'm going to push that just a little further. If we're going to use the work illustration and we have contracts, let's use the term covenant to talk about God's arrangement with his people. He had made a covenant with them that if you will be my people, I will be your God. If you will be faithful to me, I will swell the land with milk and honey and water, and your crops and your babies will be healthy and strong. And you need to be faithful to me. And again, the purpose of that faithfulness was to show all the other nations, hey, look what godliness can look like. And what returning to God can do for us as a humanity. That's what it was supposed to do. That was the fruit God was looking for. So he kept sending messengers saying, hey, there's no fruit. Where's the fruit? And they kept saying, we're not giving you that fruit. We're going to do our own thing. So for me, there's a couple of things here. Two things that stands out along the lines that Rick has given you. They didn't supply what God wanted, and they wanted the charge of it themselves. See when he says, I will send my son, when the tenants saw him, 14, this is the heir, let's kill him so that what is God's can be ours. That this tenant no longer belongs to somebody else. It's not a tenancy anymore, we're the owners. This is the standard fare for almost every human. I don't want anyone above me. I want to be the top dog. I don't want somebody telling me how to do, so I want to be in charge myself. And this manifests into almost all of our human problems with each other, with our own lives, with how we parent, with our jobs. Okay, here we go. Raise your hand if you have loved every boss you've ever had. Ah. Okay. All right, I'll take that as an answer. Yeah. Pure piety there from Rick, thank you. That's good. So here's the problem. There's always this power struggle, and it's all around us. Do you remember when your dad would say, I'm not giving you a reason, you just have to do it because I'm in charge? And we would go, I don't like that answer. Okay, Lincoln did that to me just yesterday. Right? Lincoln, you're just going to have to do it because I said so. I hated that with a great loathing from my dad. And that's just human nature. They don't want to be tenants anymore. They want to seize the opportunity to have the thing for themselves, the inheritance. All that we produce will be ours. We don't owe it to anybody. Sin consists in the failure to give God his proper place and to give to him what is due. So let me ask you a couple of questions. What is God due from us? Okay, loyalty, service. Okay, everything, our lives. Good. Yeah, I mean, this whole thing is his, right? And so you can move very easily into an application on stewardship, and we'll do that in just a second. This really has been a problem where we usurp the place of God. We say, God, please step down from that throne. I'd like to sit there myself. I don't want you in charge of my life. And anything that I produce, I want it for myself. So, if you're brave, give me some examples of how we do this in our own lives today. How does this manifest? Give me some places where we say to God, I don't want you in charge of this. I want to be in charge of it. And how does that look? Anybody got any examples of that? Okay. Yeah, I'm going to come to the stewardship of time in a minute. So that is one of them. Our money, absolutely. In the American system, well, the Western system, we don't want anybody telling us how to spend our money, do we? When I preach a sermon on giving, everybody's sitting there like this. No, I don't want the preacher telling me how to give. There's a lot of things like that that we recoil against and we kind of bristle against. And anytime you have that experience where you feel like that's making me uncomfortable, you should immediately stop and say, wait, why is it making me uncomfortable? Is that making me uncomfortable because God is asking in his place of power for me to give him some fruit that I don't want to give him? You should always analyze that feeling when it comes along. If you'd like to grow, if that is. Okay. 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 Very good. Love and patience. You could add to that forgiveness. There are some people that we absolutely feel like I don't want them to have my forgiveness. For as long as they have hurt me and they have never said anything to me about it, I have some sense of power to not forgive them. And God asks us to bear fruit in keeping with repentance, right? And that forgiveness offered is very hard, and we bristle against that. Any other examples that you can think of where we take God off his throne? Okay. So there's a couple of things in this passage that speaks about God, and I've kind of talked about it a little bit. The tenants were given long enough to have done something. And if you're looking at the whole scope of Israel, what are we talking about from, maybe let's just say from Joshua into the land to where we're speaking now with Jesus, maybe 1,300 years. So, what's that, is it 6 times the length that America has been a country? 5 times, something like that? So you could create America and bring it to this point 5 times in the amount of time that Israel has had to be faithful to God, and they haven't done it. What does that speak about God's nature? What does that say about his nature? He is absolutely, that's the word I'm looking for. How great is the patience of God to us? How often we press back against a God who is perfect in justice and yet somehow extends to us patience. That stems from, and this is something I'm constantly pushing on, that he is not just the judge with the gavel. He is a father looking at all of us like children. And for the longest time, growing up, kind of had the skewed version of God who was just this just God with the gavel ready to judge. As I kind of matured in my Christianity a bit, I came into a balance between a loving father who looks at his son and says, son, you're not getting this right, and I want you to. The judge doesn't do that. The judge says, violation, justice. And a lot of us have that view of God, that we violate, God reaps justice, and he will. But he is also at the same time a father who says, there has to be justice, but I would love to extend patience and mercy. And when you put the two of those together, father and judge together, you have a more holistic picture of God. And you see it pretty clearly here. Because what happens in the end? There is justice. There is punishment. But there's also 3 times God has said, please. And he finally says, how about my son? And they still don't. So firstly, for me, this parable speaks a great deal about the patience of God. And somebody put it like this. If some human had created the world and all of us in it, they would have destroyed it long ago. But we would not put up with what we do and what the world has done to God. We would have hit the delete button. I'm not having that. But God continues to put up with humanity. And you can appeal to passages like John 3:16 and others that just speak of the love of God, even though we can't really get our heads around it. He seems to be ever patient, and that's a good thing. But in contrast to that, we also can clearly see a God of justice here. There is a reckoning that finally came when the fruit isn't delivered. And again, I think that helps us balance this picture of a father and a judge. The Romans had a god called Justice. She was a woman with a blindfold and scales in her hand. As a matter of fact, I believe the American justice system uses a little kind of figurine of her blindly holding justice. That really came from the Roman pantheon of gods. Justice is blind, and she had a blindfold on, and she just carried out justice. So here's what the Romans said about the god Justice. Justice holds the scales with an even and scrupulous balance, and in the end she will prevail. So that was how the Romans talked about justice, but it's a good description of how God carries it out. He is absolute, it's part of his nature, and he will prevail in justice, but he always wants, and you always see it, him to supply the opportunity to not carry it out. Maybe some examples from your own parenting. If you had good parents, you were able to step out of line here and there as a kid and not immediately hear the belt coming through the belt loops, right? What would come first? Yes. I distinctly remember sitting somewhere around here. My dad was preaching, and he stopped his sermon and looked right at me and pointed because I was making a racket. He didn't say anything, but that was the warning. And so God does that too. Sometimes he stops everything to get our attention, and we go, all right, and sometimes we listen, and sometimes what? Dad has to stop his sermon and take us outside. And that has happened to me too in a small church in Texas. And I won't. So we'll not talk about that. Anyway, but so God does both. He sometimes we'll just say, stop it. And don't we do that to our kids too? We say, hey, stop it, pay attention, or listen. Sometimes I'll lean over to Scarlett when she's calling and say, you're supposed to be singing, and then she'll sit up. So sometimes we just need a little guidance, a little correction. Sometimes we need an actual focused, you're almost on the verge of trouble. And then sometimes we actually need that punitive correction because that correction brings us back in line. We're not bad because we needed correction, we're out of line. And we can be brought back into line again. And that's what God constantly wants. It's only a son who will not bend to correction that God will ultimately punish. And that's what we see here. So there is justice, and there is patience together. Their use of the psalm, Jesus' use of the Psalm 118, was the same that was used when he was going into Jerusalem, the triumphal entry. Let's see if I can find it. Yes, so in 1938, blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. I believe that comes from Psalm 118. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong. I can find the reference. Yeah, Psalm 118, 26. And then here, having had that experience, right? Jesus went into Jerusalem, maybe the same day, maybe the day before, and all of the people were quoting this psalm, and now Jesus uses this psalm to point at the Sadducees and says, hey, listen, if you don't believe what I'm saying about this, what about this psalm? People were singing it. You know it. The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone, the main thing. And they saw it. This response from them, surely not. What does that show us? Is it disbelief or rebellion? What do you think? I think it is. I think the tenants have been in charge so long now that when somebody comes and says, you're not going to be the bosses anymore, they're like, psh, says who? Isn't that where they started? Who gave you the authority? The presumption on their part is that we're in charge. And Jesus says, actually, you're not in charge at all. You're just the tenants. And if you won't tenant correctly, you'll be removed. And they bristle to that. They're like, it's not true. Surely not. And so Jesus, like my dad from the pulpit, looks right at them. He says, oh yeah? What about this? Everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces. And when it falls on anyone, it will crush him. It's undefeatable. The power is too great. It's too heavy to ignore. And it will come out in the end. So I want to circle back now, for the few minutes that I have, to some of those uncomfortable questions that I have been asking. What in my life do I functionally treat as mine rather than reckoning it as entrusted to me? So we talked about time, so we'll come back to that in just a minute. Give me some things in your life, if you're willing to, that you treat as if it belongs to you, when actually you should treat it as something that's been entrusted to you. Absolutely, that's the second one I have. I've got time and kids, and I've got one more. It's an obvious one. It's kind of already mentioned, actually. What do we treat as mine? We put it in banks. We invest it. Yes, we give it to those who we will. These are the three main ones for me. There's others. But our children, if we look at our children as mine rather than entrusted by God, we are in a serious risk of not giving them back to the one who entrusted them to us. Okay? And so what we prioritize for them and live vicariously through them sometimes, rather than helping them get back to the one who entrusted them to us, puts them in peril and puts us in peril. Because when, by and by, God asks us for the fruit, what will we give him? So we have to be very careful how we parent our kids, because they're not ours. Every soul belongs to the Lord, right? Okay. Let's talk about time. I think finances is pretty obvious. How do we use time in a way that we act as if it's ours rather than entrusted to us? Yes. In what ways? What does that look like? Okay. Sure. Okay. We choose to employ our time. She said sometimes we distance ourselves from the rest of the community of God's people, and so we choose to make incorrect uses of our time. What else? I think this one can be expanded a little bit. Okay. If you knew you had 24 hours to live, and at the end of 24 hours you drop dead, how would that change the way we use our time? What would we do? All of our priorities instantly change, don't they? What would we do? We would get in the car and we would immediately go and see who? We'd go see our kids. We'd go see our moms. We would go take care of all of the lasting finances so that the ones that are going to be left are going to be able to take care of what's left. So if that's what we would do if we knew that our time was short, why don't we spend our time that way presently? Why don't we prioritize our time appropriately now? Well, because we think we have a great deal of it. Time is the only commodity we spend, and we don't know how much we have. Like if you knew you had $20 in the bank, you're not going to go to the Texas Roadhouse. You're going to go buy milk and you're going to buy bread because you know you've only got this much. And time is very much like this. We're free with it, even though we don't know how much we have. It's wild. And if then God is going to take an accounting of our time, what did you do with the time that you had? What fruit can we give him? What can we say? This is what I did. And he will be pleased with that. That's a tough question for me. That's a tough question. I have to rack my brain on that. Am I spending the time God has given me appropriately in the raising of my kids, in the interacting with the people around me that I can influence for good? Even in my own personal time, am I spending my time in a profitable way? That becomes a great challenge to think about. And then, of course, finances is an obvious one. Okay, I've got 2 questions for you, and my time is up. You can't answer these out loud. Well, you could, but you won't. So I'll just give them to you to think about. If God came looking for fruit today from your life, what would he receive? Okay, so don't answer that. Just meditate on it. And here's the second question, and the class is yours. If God was to send a messenger to you to correct some wrong in your life, what would they be correcting? Okay, so what fruit and what correction? Those are yours. And thank you. Mm-hmm. Okay. Uh-huh. Yeah, sure. Sure. For your church? Yeah. That's right. That's right. That's right. That's right, Daryl. That's right.